I am Nora, 32 years old, and the CEO of a venture capital firm in Manhattan. But 15 years ago, I was just a discarded teenager freezing to death in the Chicago snow. My parents believed my younger sister's vicious lie and kicked me out into a subzero blizzard, telling me I was a sick, thieving daughter they no longer needed. 2 hours later, the police called them to the emergency room. When my father walked in ready to play the concerned parent for the cops, his hands started violently shaking at the sight of the elegant woman sitting by my hospital bed. The woman he had told me was dead. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own empire after your family tried to destroy you. The air in the grand foyer of our Lincoln Park mansion was suffocatingly tense. I was 17 years old, standing with my backpack slung over one shoulder, staring in absolute disbelief at my 13-year-old sister Sloane. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime. Tears streamed down her perfectly flushed cheeks as she cradled her left arm, which featured 3 angry red scratches she had deliberately inflicted upon herself just moments before our parents walked into the room. "Look what she did to me!" Sloane sobbed, her voice trembling with manufactured terror. "I just asked her why she was going through your jewelry box, Mom, and she attacked me. She was trying to run away with it." "Catherine," my stepmother gasped and immediately rushed to Sloane's side, wrapping her arms around the golden child she had always favored. My biological father, William, stood frozen for a second before his face contorted into a mask of pure rage. He marched over to me, grabbed my backpack, and dumped its contents onto the pristine marble floor. Schoolbooks, pens, and a spare sweater tumbled out, followed by the heavy, unmistakable clatter of Catherine's diamond tennis necklace. "I did not take that," I pleaded, my voice cracking under the weight of their glaring accusations. "I swear to you, Dad, she planted it there. She has been trying to get me in trouble all week." The slap came so fast I did not even have time to brace myself. The force of William's hand striking my cheek sent me crashing to the hard floor. The metallic taste of blood immediately filled my mouth. I looked up at the man who was supposed to protect me, searching for any flicker of parental love, but his eyes were completely devoid of warmth. "Get out!" William snarled, pointing a shaking finger toward the heavy oak front door. "I am done dealing with your lies, your jealousy, and your pathetic attempts to ruin this family. I do not need a sick, thieving daughter under my roof. Get out of my house before I call the police and have you arrested for grand larceny." "But Dad, it is below zero outside," I begged, scrambling to my knees. "There is a blizzard warning. I do not have anywhere to go. I do not have any money." Catherine sneered, tightening her protective grip around Sloane, who was hiding a triumphant smirk behind her hands. "That sounds like a problem for a thief to figure out on her own," Catherine said coldly. "You have poisoned this house for long enough, Nora. We have given you everything, and this is how you repay us. You attack your innocent sister and try to steal from me. You are exactly like your unstable mother." William grabbed me by the collar of my thin flannel shirt, hauled me to my feet, and shoved me toward the door. I managed to grab my coat, but he kicked my backpack out of reach. The heavy door opened, unleashing a violent howl of freezing wind and snow into the foyer. He pushed me out onto the icy porch and slammed the door shut. The deadbolt clicked loudly, sealing my fate. I stood on the porch for what felt like hours, pounding my raw fists against the frozen wood, begging them to let me in. The wind cut through my thin jacket like shattered glass. The temperature was dropping rapidly, hovering near -10 degrees, and the snow was already ankle-deep. When the porch lights abruptly clicked off, plunging me into absolute darkness, the devastating reality washed over me. They were not going to open the door. They wanted me to freeze. I stumbled down the driveway, wrapping my arms tightly around my shivering torso. Every step through the accumulating snow felt like lifting lead weights. I had no phone, no money, and no destination. I walked for blocks, the biting wind stripping away my body heat. My fingers and toes burned with agonizing pain before transitioning into a terrifying, heavy numbness. My vision began to blur, the streetlights smearing into hazy halos. The urge to simply lie down in a snowbank and sleep became overwhelmingly seductive. My knees buckled outside a closed convenience store, and I collapsed against the brick wall, the icy darkness swallowing my consciousness entirely. I woke up to the sterile smell of antiseptic and the rhythmic, urgent beeping of a heart monitor. The blinding fluorescent lights of a hospital emergency room forced my eyes open. I was buried under multiple heated blankets and IV drip taped securely to my hand. A police officer was standing near the door, speaking in hushed tones to a nurse. A few minutes later, the door swung open and William rushed in, followed closely by Catherine. They had clearly prepared their script for the authorities. Catherine was dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue, while William put on his best performance of a frantic, deeply concerned father. "Oh, my poor baby," Catherine cried loudly, making sure the police officer heard her performance. "We were so worried. She ran out into the storm after a teenage argument. We drove around for hours looking for her." William stepped toward my bed, his face a mask of fake relief. "Nora, sweetheart, why would you run away like that? You terrified your mother and me." I was too weak to speak, my throat raw and my chest aching, but the absolute disgust in my eyes must have been evident. The police officer stepped forward, holding a notepad. "Mr. Sinclair." The paramedics found her nearly frozen to death with a bruised cheek. "Are you certain this was just a simple runaway situation?" Before William could spin another masterful lie, the heavy hospital doors swung open again. The sound of confident, sharp heels clicking against the linoleum floor made everyone turn. A woman in her late 60s walked into the room. She was draped in a tailored cashmere coat, her silver hair styled immaculately, her posture radiating absolute authority and wealth. She was accompanied by two men in dark suits, who looked distinctly like high-priced corporate lawyers. William turned around, and the fake concern completely vanished from his face. All the blood drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking like he had just seen a ghost. His jaw dropped, and his hands began shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of my hospital bed to steady himself. "You," William stammered, taking a stumbling step backward. "You cannot be here. You are dead." The woman did not even look at him at first. She walked straight to my bedside, her piercing blue eyes locking onto mine. She reached out and gently touched my unbruised cheek, a look of profound sorrow and fierce protectiveness crossing her elegant features. "I am Genevieve Sinclair," she said softly to me. "I am your mother's mother. I am your grandmother, Nora. I have been looking for you for a very long time." I stared at her in shock. William had always told me my maternal grandmother died before I was born, leaving my mother with nothing but debts. He used that lie to justify why I had no family outside of him and Catherine. Genevieve slowly turned around to face William. The warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by an icy fury that made the room drop 10 degrees. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, and threw them violently against William's chest. The papers scattered across the floor like falling snow. "You told me my daughter died in childbirth and the baby did not survive," Genevieve said, her voice dangerously quiet but echoing with power. "You forged death certificates. You blocked every private investigator I hired. You took the $2 million trust fund my daughter left for Nora, drained it to save your pathetic failing real estate company, and used my granddaughter as a punching bag for your new wife." Catherine bristled, trying to regain control of the room. "Excuse me, you cannot just barge in here and make these wild accusations. We are her legal guardians. We are her parents." Genevieve did not even blink. She signaled to one of her lawyers, who stepped forward and handed a file to the police officer. "That is a court-ordered DNA test, confirming our biological relationship, along with an emergency injunction for temporary custody signed by a judge 20 minutes ago," Genevieve stated flawlessly. "I also have the original trust fund documents and the financial audits proving William has been embezzling millions of dollars meant for Nora's care. If you so much as breathe in my granddaughter's direction again, William, I will not just take your company. I will make sure you spend the rest of your miserable life in a federal penitentiary." William was completely speechless, his arrogance entirely shattered. He looked like a cornered rat, his eyes darting between the police officer, the lawyers, and Genevieve. Catherine grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the door, realizing they had lost this battle spectacularly. "Today, I am taking my granddaughter home to New York," Genevieve declared, her voice ringing with absolute finality. Do not ever contact her again. As they scurried out of the hospital room, humiliated and terrified, Genevieve sat down in the chair next to my bed. She took my freezing hand in her warm one. "You never have to go back to that house, Nora," she whispered fiercely. "You are a Sinclair, and Sinclairs do not freeze in the dark. We own the light." 15 years passed. I am now 32 years old, sitting in my expansive corner office on the 60th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper. The skyline of New York stretched out before me, a vast empire of glass and steel. As the CEO and founder of Sinclair Capital, a premier venture capital firm specializing in hostile takeovers and distressed asset acquisitions, I had built a reputation that commanded fear and respect on Wall Street. I was no longer the shivering, helpless teenager kicked out into the snow. Thanks to my grandmother's relentless mentorship and the trust fund she recovered for me, I had a mind like a steel trap and a heart meticulously guarded against sentimentality. The door to my office chimed, and my executive assistant stepped in, placing a thick red leather binder on my mahogany desk. "The comprehensive financial audit you requested on Williams Corporate Holdings," she announced professionally. "The numbers are worse than we projected." I opened the binder, my eyes scanning the spreadsheets with clinical precision. It was a beautiful disaster. Over the past decade, Williams' real estate development company had hemorrhaged money. He had over-leveraged his assets, taken out massive loans from predatory shadow lenders, and was desperately trying to maintain the facade of a wealthy Chicago elite while secretly drowning in toxic debt. He was months away from declaring bankruptcy and losing the very mansion he had thrown me out of. But William was nothing if not a survivor, and he had found a new lifeline. I flipped to the final section of the dossier, which contained a detailed background check on my sister Sloane. The golden child was now 28, living a life of superficial luxury funded entirely by debt. But she had managed to secure the ultimate prize. She was newly engaged to a man named Terrence. Terrence was a 34-year-old African-American tech genius who had built a revolutionary logistics software company from scratch. He was a self-made millionaire, brilliant, highly respected, and entirely too trusting. According to my analysts, William and Catherine were aggressively pushing for a corporate merger between William's failing real estate empire and Terrence's booming tech firm. They were using Sloane as the bait to secure Terrence's capital planning, to drain his company's resources, to pay off their insurmountable debts. Terrence was being used as a human piggy bank, blindingly unaware that he was marrying into a family of parasites. I leaned back in my leather chair, a slow, calculated smile touching my lips. William thought he had found his salvation. He thought he could ruin another innocent person's life to save his own skin, just like he had done to my mother, and just like he had tried to do to me. But he had no idea who held his debt. Over the past 6 months, through a web of anonymous shell companies and offshore accounts, Sinclair Capital had been quietly buying up every single one of William's bad loans, defaulted mortgages, and junk bonds. I was now his largest creditor. I owned him. The time for patience was over. I picked up my sleek fountain pen and signed the authorization document that would set the final stage of my trap into motion. "Book me a flight to Chicago," I told my assistant, closing the red binder with a satisfying snap. "William is hosting a charity gala this weekend to formally announce Sloane's engagement and pitch his new merger. Make sure my name is on the VIP guest list under my corporate alias. It is time to go home and collect what is mine." The ballroom of the Drake Hotel in Chicago was draped in gold silk and suffocating pretension. It was the annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala, a highly publicized event where the city's most ruthless billionaires gathered to buy social absolution. I stood on the mezzanine balcony, a glass of sparkling water in hand, observing the extravagant display below. My corporate alias, Eleanor Frost, had secured me an exclusive VIP table right next to the event's hosts. Down on the floor, William was in his element. He was desperately playing the role of a wealthy titan of industry. He wore a bespoke tuxedo that I knew for a fact was purchased on a maxed-out line of credit. Beside him, Catherine dripped in rented emeralds, complaining loudly to a passing waiter about the temperature of her champagne. To the untrained eye, my father and stepmother were the absolute picture of Chicago elite. To me, they were walking corpses carrying dead weight in toxic debt. And then there was Sloane. At 28, my younger sister had perfected the art of the superficial heiress. She was clinging tightly to the arm of her fiancé, Terrence. Terrence stood tall and dignified. He was an African-American man whose sharp, tailored suit could not entirely hide his underlying discomfort with the ostentatious display around him. He was a genuine self-made tech millionaire, a man who had built a logistics empire from a crowded garage in Detroit. Looking at him, I could see the quiet intelligence in his eyes, a stark contrast to the performative vacuity of the family, attempting to consume his wealth. Behind his back, I knew William and Catherine made condescending remarks about his background, but to his face they worshipped his bank accounts. Sloane was loudly bragging to a group of socialites, framing his hard-earned success as if it were her own personal accessory. I watched as she snapped her fingers at a busboy, scolding the young man for bumping into her chair. Terrence gently intervened, thanking the busboy and apologizing for his fiancé's temper, his decency shining through the toxic environment. Sloane simply rolled her eyes, flashing a massive engagement ring that she had undoubtedly picked out and charged to his corporate accounts. I watched as William placed a heavy hand on Terrence's shoulder, steering him toward a group of prominent venture capitalists. William was loudly boasting about the impending merger between his real estate firm and Terrence's tech platform. He spun a magnificent tale of synergistic growth, projecting an image of absolute financial security. He was hiding the desperate reality that he was using Terrence's liquid assets to plug the gaping, bleeding holes in his own sinking ship. Terrence smiled politely, but his jaw was tight. He was a brilliant engineer and businessman, but he was clearly out of his depth in the manipulative shark tank of old money elites. He was being paraded around like a prize pony, and William was the auctioneer holding the gavel. It was time to make my entrance. I adjusted the emerald green silk of my evening gown. It was a custom piece that projected absolute authority. My hair was styled in a sleek, sharp bob, framing a face that had completely shed the hollow, terrified look of the 17-year-old girl they had thrown into the blizzard. I walked down the sweeping grand staircase with the slow, deliberate grace of an apex predator stepping into a cage of rabbits. Wealth whispers, but real power commands the room. I was escorted by the gala organizer straight toward William's table. The trap was finally set. The gala host smiled brightly as she interrupted William's desperate pitching. William, Catherine, I would like to introduce you to our most esteemed guest tonight. This is Eleanor Frost, the CEO of Vanguard Acquisitions. She flew in from New York specifically for this event. William's eyes widened completely, failing to recognize the bruised, unwanted daughter he had discarded 15 years ago. Vanguard Acquisitions was the shell company I used to quietly buy up all his toxic debt. To him, I was a billionaire savior, a golden ticket out of his impending financial ruin. He immediately dropped Terrence's shoulder and stepped forward, extending a sweaty hand. Ms. Frost, William said, his voice dripping with sycophantic charm. What an absolute honor! We have been following Vanguard's aggressive expansion in the Midwest. Your reputation precedes you. I looked at his outstretched hand for a fraction of a second too long before taking it. My grip was firm, cold, and calculated. Looking at his fake, ingratiating smile, a brief memory flashed in my mind. I saw that same hand swinging across my face, sending me crashing to the marble floor before he threw me out to freeze. I pushed the memory down, replacing it with pure ice. Mr. Sinclair. I replied, my voice smooth and perfectly modulated. I have been analyzing your portfolio very closely. You have a fascinating approach to leveraging assets. William beamed, completely missing the razor-sharp insult hidden in my words. He pulled Catherine forward. My wife, Catherine. And this is my daughter, Sloane, and her brilliant fiancé, Terrence. They are the future of our family enterprise. Catherine offered a practiced, eager smile. Sloane stepped up, looking me up and down with a rapid, calculating gaze. She assessed the threat level of my designer gown and unyielding posture. She plastered on a fake, sugary smile. "It is so lovely to meet you, Eleanor. Terrence and I are actually finalizing the merger between his tech company and my father's firm. We are creating a revolutionary logistics and real estate synergy. I am the lead strategy consultant for the transition." I turned my gaze to Sloane, raising one eyebrow. "Is that so?" I asked casually, taking a sip of my sparkling water. "Tell me, Sloane, how exactly are you structuring the liability transfers? Integrating a debt-heavy traditional real estate portfolio with an agile tech company usually triggers severe liquidity constraints. Are you using a reverse triangular merger to bypass shareholder approval, or simply diluting Terrence's equity to absorb the toxic assets?" The silence that followed was deafening. Sloane's sugary smile froze on her face. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She glanced frantically at William, completely out of her depth. She did not know what a reverse triangular merger was. She barely knew how to balance her own checking account. "Well," William stammered, his forehead glistening with sudden sweat. "We have a team of accountants handling the granular details. Sloane provides the high-level visionary direction." "I see," I said, allowing a cold, dismissive smirk to touch my lips. "Vision is easy. Math is unforgiving." I shifted my attention to Terrence, who was watching me with a sudden, intense focus. He had caught the precision of my questions and the blatant panic in his future father-in-law's eyes. I extended my hand to him. "Terrence, your work on algorithmic supply chain routing is exceptional. I read your latest quarterly filing. Your profit margins are pristine. It is incredibly rare to see a founder scale a company entirely debt-free. It makes you a very attractive target." Terrence shook my hand, his grip solid and respectful. "Thank you, Ms. Frost," he said, his deep voice carrying a note of cautious curiosity. "I believe in sustainable growth. Debt has a habit of making decisions for you." "Exactly," I replied, maintaining eye contact with him just long enough to let the implications sink in. "Which is why one must be extraordinarily careful about the liabilities they marry into. A pristine balance sheet can be completely destroyed overnight if you merge with a sinking ship." Sloane bristled, sensing the shift in Terrence's demeanor. She stepped closer to him, flashing her diamond ring again. "Well, Terrence and I are partners in everything, business and life. I suppose a woman focused entirely on corporate acquisitions would not understand the value of family loyalty. It must be lonely at the top, Ms. Frost." I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that cut through the polite chatter of the ballroom. "I find that loneliness is vastly superior to being surrounded by parasites, Sloane. A bad investment will only cost you money, but a toxic family will cost you your life." William let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh, stepping physically between Terrence and me to block the conversation. "Ms. Frost, I would love to arrange a private meeting next week to discuss a potential capital injection from Vanguard. We have some incredibly lucrative developments on the horizon. I am sure we can find a mutually beneficial arrangement." I looked at the man who had left me to die. I saw the desperate greed in his eyes, the hollow facade of his entire existence. "I am sure you do, William," I said, dropping the formal title just to watch him twitch. "I am actually reviewing your primary lender agreements as we speak. I will be in touch very soon. We have a great deal of history to catch up on." William nodded enthusiastically, completely oblivious to the double meaning. "I look forward to it." As I turned to walk away, Sloane could not resist trying to reclaim the spotlight. "We are hosting an engagement party next Friday, Eleanor. You should come. Terrence is buying me a matching diamond necklace to celebrate. It is going to be the event of the season." I paused, looking back at Sloane over my shoulder. "A diamond necklace," I repeated, my voice dropping to a chillingly soft register. "How fitting. Just make sure the check actually clears, Sloane. I hear the banks are becoming awfully strict about insufficient funds these days." I walked away, leaving Sloane fuming in her rented dress and William wiping the sweat from his brow. Behind them, Terrence was staring at my retreating figure, a deep frown creasing his forehead as his analytical mind began to piece together the warning I had just handed him. The bait was taken. The poison was in the water. I made my way toward the secluded bourbon tasting bar, located at the far end of the ballroom. The lighting here was dimmer, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany counter. I ordered a neat bourbon, savoring the burn of the amber liquid as it slid down my throat. I knew my abrupt departure from the table would not be the end of our interaction. Predators like William and his offspring never let a perceived bag of money walk away that easily. Right on cue, the sharp clacking of stilettos echoed behind me. I turned slowly, resting my glass on the marble counter. Sloane was marching toward me with Terrence trailing half a step behind. Up close, the panic in her eyes was masked by a thick layer of unwarranted arrogance. She had clearly pulled Terrence away from his networking to do some aggressive pitching of her own, completely convinced that her last name alone gave her leverage. Eleanor. She began dropping my formal alias entirely. I am glad I caught you before you left. I know my father can be a bit old-fashioned with his pitch, so I wanted to speak with you woman to woman. I turned fully to face her, letting my silence stretch. I did not invite her to use my first name. You see, Sloane continued oblivious to the icy reception. Terrence and I are building something much bigger than just a software platform. We are creating a lifestyle brand. His tech is fine, obviously, but it needs my creative direction to scale properly. I am bringing his company out of the inner city grit and into the luxury market. That is where the real money is. I am sure someone in your position understands that raw coding talent is useless without a sophisticated face to sell it. She reached over and patted Terrence on the chest, a gesture so deeply patronizing it made my stomach turn. Terrence visibly stiffened. His jaw locked and a muscle ticked in his cheek. He had built a logistics empire that revolutionized supply chain management from the ground up, yet his fiancée was reducing his life's work to inner-city grit that needed her supposedly superior aristocratic touch to be palatable. We are willing to let Vanguard Acquisitions in on the ground floor of our new venture, Sloane said, taking a sip from a champagne flute she had snatched from a passing waiter without a word of thanks. Terrence is handling the back end, but I am managing the capitalization. We need a $50 million injection to expedite the merger with my father's firm and launch my new rebranding initiative. I think it would be a cute partnership. You provide the capital, and I provide the social access. It is a win for everyone. I stared at her. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her proposal was breathtaking. She was asking for $50 million while essentially calling her brilliant fiancé a blue-collar grunt who needed a rich savior to make his company presentable. A cute partnership, I repeated, swirling the bourbon in my glass. The ice clinked softly against the crystal. Tell me, Sloane, when you say you are managing the capitalization, what exactly does that entail? Because from my preliminary review of Terrence's company, his user acquisition cost is remarkably low. His churn rate is virtually non-existent, and his operating cash flow is exceptionally healthy. He does not need $50 million to scale. Sloane waved her hand dismissively. Oh, the tech side is fine. The capital is for the integration phase. My father's company has a lot of legacy real estate that we need to modernize. Plus, our wedding is next month, and we are acquiring a new estate in the Hamptons to serve as our East Coast headquarters. We have a very high burn rate right now, but it is necessary for the brand. I shifted my gaze to Terrence. He looked utterly humiliated. His dark eyes were fixed on Sloane with a mixture of disbelief and growing horror. He was finally hearing her say the quiet parts out loud. A brand, I said, taking a slow step toward her. Let us talk about your brand, Sloane. Your father's legacy real estate is actually a portfolio of defaulting commercial mortgages. His debt-to-equity ratio is currently sitting at an abysmal 4-to-1. He is facing margin calls from 3 different shadow lenders. Sloane's smug expression faltered. The color began to drain from her face. That is not true. My father is a titan. Your father is a sinking stone. I corrected, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. And you are planning to tie Terrence to his ankles and push them both into the river. If Terrence signs that merger agreement, his pristine company assumes all of William's toxic liabilities. Terrence will be personally guaranteeing debts he had absolutely no part in creating. Your $50 million request is not for a cute partnership. It is a bailout to save your family from bankruptcy, padded with enough extra cash to fund your vanity real estate purchases. Terrence stepped forward, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Sloan, what margin calls is she talking about? You told me the real estate firm was completely solvent. You showed me the audit reports. Sloan stammered, looking frantically between Terrence and me. Terrence, baby, do not listen to her. She does not know what she is talking about. My father's accountant said everything is perfectly fine. We just have a minor liquidity gap. A minor liquidity gap, I echoed, turning the knife. An interesting term for impending insolvency. I suggest you ask your brilliant fiancé to review those audit reports himself. I imagine you only showed him the pro forma statements, completely omitting the off-balance sheet liabilities. I stepped closer to Terrence, ignoring Sloan entirely. You built your company on efficiency, Terrence. You optimized supply chains by eliminating dead weight. Look closely at the family you are marrying into. They do not want your software. They want your credit rating. They view your hard work as a piggy bank to fund their delusions of grandeur. Terrence's fists clenched at his sides. The shame and anger radiating from him were palpable. He looked at Sloan, really looked at her perhaps for the first time without the blinders of affection. He saw the panic in her eyes, the desperation of a grifter whose con had just been exposed. We are leaving, Terrence said to Sloan. His voice was absolute ice. We are leaving right now, and you are going to show me every single original financial document from your father's office. But Terrence, the gala just started. Sloan whined, trying to grab his arm. We cannot just leave my parents. Terrence pulled his arm away from her grasp as if she had burned him. I am not asking, Sloan. We are leaving. He turned back to me, giving me a brief, stiff nod. Ms. Frost, thank you for your extreme candor. I appreciate a direct warning. I raised my glass to him. Just performing my due diligence, Terrence. Do yours before you sign anything. I watched them walk away. Terrence was taking long, furious strides toward the exit, while Sloan practically had to jog to keep up her designer heels clicking frantically against the floor. She was gesturing wildly already, spinning new lies to cover the old ones, but the damage was done. The seed of absolute distrust had been planted in Terrence's mind, and with his analytical brain, it would only be a matter of hours before he unraveled their entire financial conspiracy. It actually took him exactly 48 hours to reach his breaking point. On Tuesday morning, my encrypted corporate email chimed with a highly secured message from Terrence. He requested a private meeting completely off the books, away from Chicago, and away from anyone connected to William. I instructed my executive assistant to book the most secluded private suite at an exclusive members-only cigar club in Manhattan. It was a dark wood-paneled room completely shielded from the public eye, the perfect environment for dismantling an illusion. Terrence arrived precisely on time. The polished, perfectly put-together man from the charity gala was gone. In his place stood an exhausted entrepreneur who had clearly spent the last 2 nights tearing apart financial statements and screaming matches with his fiancée. He wore a simple dark sweater and jeans, his posture heavy with the crushing weight of betrayal. He took a seat across from me at the heavy oak table, bypassing the expensive scotch I had ordered and reaching straight for a glass of ice water. You were right, Terrence said, his deep voice gravelly from lack of sleep. I demanded the raw data from William's accountants. Sloan fought me on it. She cried, she played the victim, she accused me of not trusting her. But I threatened to walk away from the altar if I did not see the original ledgers. When they finally handed them over, it took me less than 3 hours to realize the entire real estate portfolio is a house of cards. I leaned back in my leather armchair, resting my hands in my lap. I did not offer him false sympathy. Pity is useless in business, and Terrence was a man who respected hard facts. I am not surprised you found the discrepancies, Terrence, I replied smoothly. You are an engineer. You build systems that detect inefficiencies. William's entire financial strategy is one massive, glaring inefficiency, but you have only scratched the surface. You saw the numbers they were willing to let you see. I am here to show you the ones they hid in the dark. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a thick, unmarked manila folder, sliding it across the polished wood table. Terrence hesitated for a fraction of a second before opening it. Those are the off-balance sheet liabilities, I explained as his eyes scanned the first page. William did not just take out bad mortgages. He engaged in mezzanine financing with predatory shadow lenders. He created over a dozen shell companies to hide his defaulted properties. If you look at page 4, you will see the cross-default provisions. Terrence flipped the page, his eyes widening as he read the highlighted legal jargon. His jaw tightened so hard I could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. If one property defaults, they all go into default, Terrence muttered, tracing the lines of text with his finger. And the interest rates on these secondary loans are astronomical. This is not a minor liquidity gap. This is a $300 million crater. Exactly, I said, leaning forward and tapping the document. Now let us talk about your merger agreement. Sloan told you the integration would allow your logistics platform to optimize their commercial properties. But look at the structuring clause on page 12 of the contract she pushed you to sign. Terrence turned the pages quickly. I watched the exact moment his analytical mind processed the legal trap. He stopped breathing for a second, his dark eyes locked on the paper. They included a cross-collateralization clause. He whispered, the absolute horror of the situation dawning on him. Yes, I confirmed coldly. The minute you sign that merger, your proprietary algorithms, your secure servers, and the flawless cash flow of your logistics empire become the primary collateral for William's toxic debt. The lenders I just showed you would have the legal right to seize your company's assets to pay off William's failures. Your life's work would be liquidated in a matter of months to save his mansion. Terrence dropped the folder on the table. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, taking a long, shaky breath. He was a man who had climbed out of poverty, who had built a clean, honest business from a garage in Detroit, only to realize he had been targeted for a corporate slaughter. Sloan gave me a prenuptial agreement last week, Terrence said, his voice terrifyingly quiet. She told me it was just a standard family document, a formality to protect her father's heritage. She kissed me and told me it was just paperwork to keep the board of directors happy. I did not break my gaze. Let me guess. It includes a provision that waives your right to separate property regarding business assets if they are commingled after the marriage. He nodded slowly, looking up at me with eyes that were now completely devoid of affection for his fiancée. It was a targeted acquisition. The romance, the engagement, the wedding planning. She never loved me. She was just the bait. I was nothing but a bailout fund for a family of frauds. It is a bitter pill to swallow, I said, allowing a sliver of genuine understanding into my voice. But acknowledging the poison is the only way to purge it from your system. They looked at your background, Terrence. They saw a self-made man from the outside who was eager to build a legacy, and they decided your decency made you an easy mark. They thought you would be too blinded by the glamour of their society to read the fine print. Terrence closed the folder, his hands no longer shaking. The exhaustion in his posture was suddenly replaced by a cold, rigid fury. "Why are you showing me this, Eleanor?" he asked, his tone sharpening. "Vanguard Acquisitions is a predatory fund. You buy distressed assets. If William drags my company down with his, you could buy us both for pennies on the dollar. Why warn me?" "Because I prefer to do business with the smartest player in the room, not the desperate ones," I lied, smoothly maintaining my corporate alias. "William is a sinking ship and I have already bought his debt. I own him. But your company is an actual asset. I would rather see you survive this and remain a powerful force in the market. Consider this professional courtesy." I stood up, buttoning my tailored blazer. I gathered my briefcase, leaving the damning documents on the table for him to keep. I looked down at the brilliant, betrayed man sitting before me, knowing that the next few days would define the rest of his life. "You are a brilliant man, Terrence," I said, my voice dropping to a chilling absolute warning. "You built an empire with your own 2 hands. Do not let your goodness be weaponized against you. A family built on lies will suck you dry, destroy everything you have created, and then blame you for bleeding out. Cut the infection out before it reaches your heart." I turned and walked out of the private tasting room, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me. I did not look back. I had given Terrence the ultimate weapon, and I knew exactly what a man of his caliber would do with it. The seeds of absolute ruin had been planted, and it was only a matter of time before William's entire fake dynasty collapsed under the weight of their own greed. Terrence did not go back to the penthouse he shared with Sloane. Instead, he directed his driver to the secure underground data center that housed the primary servers for his logistics company. He needed absolute privacy, an untraceable network, and a space where his mind could operate without the cloying scent of Sloane's expensive perfume distracting him. He walked past the biometric scanners, his face a mask of stone, and locked himself inside the glass-walled server room. He booted up his encrypted workstation. For the past 8 months, he had allowed Sloane to manage their joint lifestyle accounts. She had insisted on it, claiming she wanted to take the burden of household management off his shoulders so he could focus on the merger. She had framed it as an act of devotion, a demonstration of her readiness to be a supportive wife. He had thought it was a genuine partnership. Now, staring at the login screen, he realized it was an act of quarantine. She was keeping him away from the numbers. Terrence bypassed the standard banking portals and used his own proprietary data, scraping algorithms to pull the raw transaction histories directly from the financial institutions. The spreadsheets materialized on his dual monitors, rows upon rows of data flooding the screens. He began to trace the capital flow, applying the same ruthless optimization logic he used to route cargo ships across the Atlantic. The truth was mathematically undeniable. The bleeding started subtly at first. $50,000 transferred to a boutique consulting firm that, upon a quick background check, turned out to be a shell company registered to William. $100,000 wired to an offshore account classified under wedding venue deposits, which Terrence now saw had immediately bounced to a high-risk shadow lender in the Caymans to cover a margin call interest payment. But the recent transactions were brazen sloppy with panic. As William's financial reality had grown darker, Sloane had grown desperate. Terrence watched the numbers flash across the screen, his chest tightening with a sickening betrayal. $400,000 had been siphoned from his personal reserves in the last 30 days alone. She was not just paying off her father's debts. She was funding a reckless, panic-driven lifestyle to maintain their societal illusion while the ground crumbled beneath them. There were transfers to exclusive underground casinos in Macau, settling debts Terrence had no idea existed. There were massive charges for designer jewelry and bespoke fashion that were subsequently insured, reported lost, and likely sold on the secondary market for untraceable cash. Terrence leaned closer to the monitor, his dark eyes tracking a recurring series of wire transfers labeled as charitable donations to the Sinclair Family Foundation. He ran a cross-reference on the foundation's tax ID. It did not exist. The money was being funneled directly into Catherine's personal checking account to cover the lease on their supposedly owned summer home in the Hamptons. He had given Sloane unlimited access because he loved her. He had believed her tears when she claimed she was overwhelmed with the social pressures of wedding planning. He had held her while she complained about the stress of merging two powerful families, validating her fabricated exhaustion. Every single tear, every single embrace, every time she whispered that she could not wait to be his wife had been a calculated extraction tactic. She was treating him like an ATM, bleeding him dry, $100,000 at a time, smiling in his face while she robbed him blind. The anger that washed over Terrence was not hot or explosive. It was absolute freezing, absolute zero. He did not smash his keyboard or shout at the empty room. He simply sat in the humming quiet of the server room and methodically compiled every fraudulent transaction into an encrypted, unalterable ledger. He secured the evidence of wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny. He severed Sloane's access to all his accounts with a few swift keystrokes, establishing silent financial tripwires that would instantly alert him if she attempted to move another dime. The theft of his cash was a profound violation, but as he remembered Eleanor Frost's chilling warning at the cigar club, he realized the stolen cash was just the appetizer. The main course was his company. Terrence reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents Sloane had handed him 2 weeks ago. The prenuptial agreement. It was bound in heavy, textured paper bearing the seal of William's highly paid corporate attorneys. When Sloane had given it to him, she had kissed his cheek and casually mentioned it was just boilerplate language to protect her father's historical assets. She had told him her lawyers had already smoothed out the edges, and that he just needed to sign it so they could move forward with the joyous parts of planning their future together. He had trusted her explicitly. He had tossed it in his briefcase, planning to have his own counsel give it a cursory glance before signing it next week. Now he spread the pages across his desk under the harsh fluorescent lights of the server room. He began to read. He did not read like a man in love looking forward to a wedding. He read like a software engineer hunting for a malicious line of code buried deep within a complex operating system. It took him exactly 45 minutes to find the kill switch. It was buried in Section 7, subsection D, meticulously hidden beneath layers of convoluted legal jargon regarding the integration of marital assets and intellectual property management. The clause stipulated that any intellectual property developed, maintained, or upgraded during the course of the marriage would automatically become subject to a joint holding trust managed by the primary real estate entity, William's entity. Terence felt his blood run cold. His logistics algorithms, the core engine of his entire empire, required constant daily upgrades and machine learning inputs to remain functional. The minute he updated his software after the wedding, his proprietary code would legally fall into the joint holding trust. They were going to absorb his brain trust by default. He flipped to Section 12, detailing the dissolution of assets in the event of insolvency. There it was. The cross-collateralization trap Eleanor had warned him about. The document explicitly waived Terence's right to shield his independent corporate assets from the holding trust's liabilities. By signing this prenuptial agreement, Terence was effectively co-signing William's massive toxic debt without his name ever appearing on the original loan documents. If William defaulted on his shadow loans, which Terence now knew was an absolute mathematical certainty, the lenders could bypass William entirely and seize Terence's clean, highly profitable tech company to satisfy the debt. Terence would lose his algorithms, his servers, his patents, and his entire life's work. William and Sloane were not just trying to steal his cash. They were orchestrating a legal hijacking of his entire corporate identity. They planned to sacrifice him to their ruthless creditors so they could walk away clean, unburdened by debt, and maintain their lavish lifestyle on the ruins of his success. Terence stared at the signature line at the bottom of the document. The blank space where he had almost signed away his freedom, his wealth, and his dignity. Sloane had looked him in the eyes, told him she loved him, and handed him a financial suicide pact wrapped in a velvet ribbon. He remembered how her family looked at him during their country club dinners, the subtle condescension in William's voice when he called Terence a remarkably hard worker. The way Catherine always emphasized to her socialite friends that Terence was self-made, using the term as a polite aristocratic insult, highlighting his lack of generational wealth. They looked down on him. They saw his blackness, his humble beginnings on the rough streets of Detroit, his earnest nature, and they calculated that he was gullible enough to be their perfect victim. They believed they were inherently smarter than him simply because they had inherited their zip code while he had bled to earn his. They thought he was just a brilliant grunt who would be too dazzled by their old money facade to read the fine print. They had severely miscalculated. Terence carefully gathered the pages of the prenuptial agreement and placed them back into his briefcase next to the hard drive containing the irrefutable evidence of Sloane's embezzlement. The shock and the heartbreak were entirely gone, completely burned away by a ruthless, unyielding determination. He was a man who optimized massive global systems by identifying and destroying inefficiencies. The family he was about to marry into was the most toxic, parasitic inefficiency he had ever encountered in his life. He picked up his encrypted phone and dialed a secure number he had memorized from the dossier Eleanor Frost had left him at the cigar club. He knew exactly what he had to do next. He was not going to run away from the altar. He was not going to hide or quietly break off the engagement. He was going to partner with the apex predator who had warned him, and together they were going to tear William's fake dynasty straight down to the studs. The phone on my mahogany desk rang exactly twice before my executive assistant patched the call through to my private line. Terrence did not waste breath on pleasantries or introductions. His voice was a low, resonant vibration of pure, concentrated wrath. He simply asked for my location and told me he was coming up. I instructed security to grant him immediate unescorted access to the top floor of the Vanguard Acquisitions building. 10 minutes later, the heavy glass doors of my office swung open. Terrence walked in looking fundamentally changed. The polite, slightly uncomfortable tech genius I had met at the charity gala was entirely gone. In his place stood a man who had stared into the abyss of absolute betrayal and had decided to forge a weapon out of the darkness. He carried his leather briefcase with a white-knuckled grip and threw it onto the center of my desk with a heavy, definitive thud. "She stole $400,000 from my personal accounts in 30 days, Terrence said, his voice terrifyingly calm as he paced the length of my office. He did not sit down. The kinetic energy radiating from him required movement. She funneled my money to offshore gambling syndicates in Macau and shell companies registered to her mother to pay for their leased Hamptons estate. She smiled in my face, kissed me goodnight, and then logged on to wire my hard-earned cash to cover her father's margin calls. I remained seated watching him process the visceral disgust of the violation. "You found the kill switch in the prenuptial agreement," I stated, knowing full well that the cash theft was only a fraction of the insult. Terrence stopped pacing and braced his hands against the edge of my desk, leaning in close. His dark eyes were burning with a fierce, uncompromising intelligence. Section 7. Subsection D. The intellectual property transfer clause coupled with the cross-collateralization trap. They were not just stealing my money, Eleanor. They were planning to legally hijack my proprietary algorithms. They were going to feed my entire logistics platform to their shadow lenders the second William defaulted. They viewed me as nothing but a sacrificial lamb. They looked at a self-made black man from Detroit and thought I was just a naive, uneducated mark, desperate enough for their high society approval to sign my own corporate death warrant. He pushed off the desk, running a hand over his face. The exhaustion was evident, but it was entirely eclipsed by his determination. "The emotional manipulation is disgusting," he continued, his voice tightening. "But the intellectual insult is unforgivable. I am going to tear their financial structure apart bite by bite. I am going to make sure William Sinclair never signs a commercial lease in this country again. But before I open my servers to you, before we coordinate a strike, I need the truth." Terrence pulled up a chair and finally sat down, locking his gaze with mine. "You handed me the exact blueprint of their destruction. You knew the exact clauses in their legal documents. You have purchased their toxic debt through Vanguard Acquisitions, essentially cornering them into insolvency. But this level of orchestration requires more than just a desire for a hostile corporate takeover. This is surgical. This is personal." He leaned forward, entirely unyielding. "Why does a New York billionaire care so much about bankrupting a specific failing real estate family in Chicago? You hate them. I can see it in the way you look at them. I need to know exactly who I am getting into bed with before we burn their house down." I looked at the man across from me, feeling a profound sense of respect. He was brilliant, observant, and completely unwilling to be a pawn in a game he did not understand. He deserved the absolute truth. I stood up from my leather chair and walked toward the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. "You asked why this is personal, Terrence," I said, keeping my back to him for a brief moment. "You asked why I have spent the last 6 months meticulously buying up every single piece of garbage debt William has ever issued." I turned around and walked over to a large, abstract painting hanging on the far wall of my office. I pressed my thumb against a hidden biometric scanner hidden in the frame's molding. A green light flashed and the wall panel slid open with a soft mechanical hiss, revealing a heavy steel vault. I entered a 12-digit passcode and pulled the heavy metal door open. "My name is not Eleanor Frost," I said, reaching into the safe. I pulled out a thick, aged manila folder and carried it back to my desk, dropping it right next to his briefcase. I opened the folder and began spreading the documents across the polished wood. The first item I laid down was a birth certificate. The second was an original trust fund establishment document. The third was a glossy, high-resolution photograph of a severely bruised 17-year-old girl with frostbitten lips and hollow, terrified eyes lying in a hospital bed. "William Sinclair is my biological father," I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, absolute finality. "Catherine is my stepmother, and the woman who tried to steal your company, the woman who smiled in your face while she emptied your bank accounts, is my younger sister Sloane." Terrence stared at the documents on the desk. The air in the office seemed to vanish. He looked from the birth certificate bearing the name Nora Sinclair to the horrifying photograph of the battered teenager, and finally up to my face. The shock radiating from him was palpable. His analytical mind was instantly processing the massive paradigm shift, recontextualizing every single interaction he had witnessed at the charity gala. "Sloane told me she had an older sister," Terrence whispered, his voice hoarse as he stared at the photograph. "She told me her sister was mentally unstable. She said you got involved with drugs, dropped out of school, and ran away from home years ago. She painted you as a tragedy that broke her parents' hearts." I let out a harsh, humorless laugh. Of course she did. The Golden Child has always been a masterful storyteller. "Let me tell you the actual tragedy, Terrence. Let me tell you how I ended up in that hospital bed." I pointed to the bruised face in the photograph. "I was 17 years old. I was entirely dependent on them. Sloane had always resented me, but her malice peaked when she realized I was about to age into a $2 million trust fund my late mother had left for me. One evening, Sloane deliberately scratched her own arm until it bled. She stole a diamond tennis necklace from Catherine's vanity and planted it at the bottom of my school backpack. When William and Catherine walked into the foyer, Sloane put on a spectacular performance, crying and claiming I had attacked her to steal the jewelry. Terrence's jaw clenched. The disgust in his eyes was visceral. He was beginning to see the true depths of the sociopathy bred into the Sinclair family. William did not ask for my side of the story. I continued, my voice steady, betraying none of the old pain. "He backhanded me across the face so hard I hit the marble floor. He called me a sick, thieving parasite. And then he threw me out the front door." It was the middle of January in Chicago. The temperature was -10 degrees, and a blizzard was actively burying the city. I had no phone, no coat, and no money. He locked the deadbolt and turned off the porch lights. They wanted me to freeze to death, and I very nearly did. Terrence closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, absorbing the sheer, unfathomable cruelty of the act. He had survived the rough streets of Detroit, but the calculated, sanitized violence of the elite was a different breed of monster. "I collapsed outside a convenience store hours later," I said, tapping the hospital report laid out on the desk. The police called William to the emergency room. He walked in ready to play the devastated, loving father for the authorities. He had his fake tears completely ready, but he froze when he saw the woman sitting next to my bed. I pulled out the final document from the folder. It was a massive financial audit bearing the seal of the FBI. "My maternal grandmother, Genevieve Sinclair," I explained. "William had lied to me my entire life, telling me she died before I was born. In reality, he had forged death certificates and blocked her private investigators for 17 years. Why? Because the moment I turned 18, the $2 million trust fund my mother left me would require a third-party audit. William had already embezzled every single cent of that money to save his failing real estate firm. He threw me into a blizzard because a dead runaway daughter cannot demand a financial audit." Terrence let out a heavy breath, shaking his head. "He tried to murder his own child to cover up wire fraud and embezzlement. Genevieve saved my life," I said, a rare note of warmth entering my voice. "She walked into that hospital room, slammed a DNA test onto William's chest, and threatened to destroy his entire existence if he ever looked at me again. She took me to New York. She raised me. She trained me to understand leverage debt and hostile acquisitions. She taught me how to turn a balance sheet into a lethal weapon. She passed away 3 years ago, leaving me her empire. I rebranded it to Vanguard Acquisitions, and I have spent the last 6 months actively hunting my father." I sat back down in my chair, folding my hands together. "I am going to strip them of everything, Terrence. I am going to take their company, their mansion, their social standing, and their freedom. But I could not make my final move while your company was attached to their liabilities. I needed you to see them for what they were, so you could step off the tracks before the train crashed. Terrence looked at me, a profound, unbreakable solidarity forming between us. We were two people who had been targeted for our perceived weaknesses. We had both been marked as collateral damage by a family of narcissistic parasites. But we had both survived, and we both held the keys to their destruction. Next Friday, Terrence said, his voice dropping to a low, authoritative register. The gala celebrating the 30th anniversary of Sinclair Real Estate. William is using the event to formally announce our corporate merger to his shareholders and the press. He thinks I am bringing the signed contracts to the stage. Sloane thinks she is getting a diamond necklace and a $50 million wire transfer. I smiled a genuine, terrifying smile. A perfect stage. A room full of investors, media, and Chicago elite. I will take the stage, Terrence stated, his dark eyes locked onto mine. I will hold the microphone. I will build them up, and then I will introduce you. We will not just burn their house down, Nora. We will make sure the whole world watches the flames. I reached across the desk, extending my hand. Terrence grasped it firmly. The alliance was sealed in blood, betrayal, and a mutual desire for absolute ruin. The hunt was over. The slaughter was about to begin. Terrence slowly released his grip on my hand, the physical contact breaking, but the unspoken vow remaining absolute. He sank back into the leather chair, the residual adrenaline of our agreement, hardening into a block of solid ice in his chest. For a long moment, the only sound in the office was the low hum of the ventilation system. I watched his gaze drift toward the Manhattan skyline, seeing the profound, quiet devastation of a man fully processing his own commodification. He was thinking about the past year. He had climbed from the brutal, unforgiving streets of Detroit, writing code in a freezing garage until his fingers bled. He had built his logistics platform with nothing but raw intellect and a refusal to fail. He had earned every single comma in his bank account. Yet to the Sinclair family, his entire existence, his struggles, his brilliance, his blackness were nothing more than a convenient, heavily funded rescue boat. They did not see a partner. They did not see a son-in-law. They saw a walking, talking mobile bank. The microaggressions he had previously brushed off as old money ignorance suddenly snapped into sharp, horrifying focus. William calling him remarkably articulate during their first dinner. Catherine asking if his parents were overwhelmed by being in a country club. Sloane constantly complaining about his lack of generational refinement, framing her demands for his money as necessary lessons in high society etiquette. They had weaponized his humble beginnings against him. They had convinced him that handing over his credit cards and his company was the entry fee he had to pay to sit at their table. The absolute sheer audacity of their racism and classism wrapped in fake smiles and expensive champagne made Terrence physically sick. He was not a man to them. He was a financial instrument to be drained and discarded. He realized now that Sloane had never loved him. Every affectionate touch was a calculated extraction tactic. Every kiss was a transaction. Every declaration of love was simply a withdrawal slip. The profound betrayal of being used so ruthlessly stripped away any remaining ounce of mercy he might have held for her. "I am going to bankrupt them," Terrence finally said, his voice stripped of all emotion. "I am going to let them put on their tuxedos and their rented jewels. I am going to let them stand under the chandelier, and then I am going to pull the floor out from under them. How exactly do we execute this? Nora, I want no loose ends." I pulled a digital tablet across my desk, waking the screen to display a complex web of corporate structures. "The gala begins at 7 on Friday evening," I explained, tracing a line on the screen. "At exactly 9 in the morning on Friday, Vanguard Acquisitions will officially trigger the cross-default clauses on all of William's secondary shadow loans. We will freeze his operating accounts. By noon, his primary lenders will panic and issue immediate margin calls. William will be completely cut off from all liquid capital. He will not even be able to pay the caterers for the gala." Terrence leaned forward, his analytical mind immediately catching the rhythm of the trap. "He will be absolutely desperate," Terrence concluded. He will try to hide the freeze from his board of directors and the press. He will view my signature on the merger agreement as his only remaining oxygen line. He will push for a public signing on stage to instantly reassure his creditors. Exactly. I nodded, impressed by his strategic foresight. He will try to trap you in front of the cameras. He will assume you are too polite, too conditioned by social expectations to refuse him in front of a ballroom full of Chicago elite. He will hand you the pen expecting you to sign away your life's work just to avoid a public scene. Terrence let out a harsh, dark chuckle. He clearly does not know the kind of pressure I am used to. What about Sloane? She expects a $50 million wire transfer to clear by Friday afternoon. You are going to feed her delusion, I instructed, passing him a secure encrypted flash drive. Keep playing the devoted fiancé. Tell her the transfer is held up in compliance protocols, but will clear during the gala. Buy her the diamond necklace she wants. Let her wear it. Let her feel like she has won. But bring this flash drive to the stage. It contains the complete unredacted audit of her embezzlement cross-referenced with your bank statements and the fraudulent foundation accounts. Terrence pocketed the drive, his eyes cold and focused. I will have my tech team route the data to the ballroom's main projection system. When I take the microphone, I will bypass their presentation and override the screens. They will be looking at massive high-definition spreadsheets of her theft while she is standing there in her rented gown. I am also bringing the prenuptial agreement. I will read the cross-collateralization clause out loud to every single investor in that room. I want them to hear exactly how William planned to commit corporate fraud. And while you hold the floor, I will enter through the main doors. I added, feeling the thrilling anticipation of the final strike. My legal team is already finalizing a dossier for the federal authorities regarding William's initial trust fund fraud. The moment the financial illusion shatters on that stage, I will personally deliver the eviction notice. I will make sure the security detail at the Drake Hotel is fully briefed. They will lock the doors. Nobody leaves until the truth is entirely exposed. We coordinate our timing to the second. You break their public image and I seize their physical assets. Terrence stood up, his posture radiating a dangerous, controlled power. He buttoned his jacket, no longer the exhausted victim who had walked into my office an hour ago. He was a general preparing for absolute corporate warfare. Friday at 7, Terrence stated, giving me a final resolute nod. I will see you under the lights, Nora. I watched him walk out of the office, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind him. The gears of absolute destruction were finally in motion. William and Catherine thought they were hosting the social event of the season. They had no idea they had just invited their own executioners. Friday evening arrived with a chilling rain that turned the streets of Chicago into slick black mirrors. But inside the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel, the atmosphere was suffocatingly warm and gilded in desperate extravagance. I stood in the shadows of the mezzanine balcony, a silent observer, looking down at the multi-million-dollar illusion my father had constructed. The room had been transformed into a monument to Sinclair Real Estate's supposed 30-year legacy. Massive floral arrangements of white orchids and imported hydrangeas towered over 60 round tables. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the city's most ruthless elite. Waiters in white tuxedo jackets circulated with trays of vintage champagne and caviar canapes. The local media had set up a designated press corral at the back of the room, their camera lenses gleaming like the eyes of predators waiting for a show. It was a flawless facade funded entirely on borrowed time and stolen credit. Down on the floor, Catherine floated through the crowd in a custom silver gown, smiling so hard her facial muscles must have been screaming in protest. She clinked glasses with bank executives and socialites, laughing at jokes she did not understand while desperately trying to secure her position in a society that was minutes away from discarding her. Sloane was holding court near a massive ice sculpture, practically blinding the press photographers with the massive newly acquired diamond necklace resting heavily on her collarbone. She had spent the stolen money well. Terrence stood right beside her, the absolute picture of a devoted fiancé. He wore a razor-sharp midnight blue tuxedo, his expression unreadable and calm. He was playing his part flawlessly, allowing Sloane to hang on his arm and brag to her wealthy friends about her brilliant business strategies. Nobody in that glittering room knew that the heavy silk pocket of his tuxedo jacket held a single encrypted flash drive containing the absolute destruction of the Sinclair Empire. At exactly 8 o'clock, the lights in the ballroom dimmed and a solitary spotlight illuminated the grand stage at the front of the room. William strode up the carpeted steps, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. He tapped the microphone and the chaotic chatter of the wealthy attendees slowly quieted down into a respectful silence. William looked out over the sea of faces, a king surveying a kingdom he falsely believed he had successfully conned into submission. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues and cherished friends, William began, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. 30 years ago, Sinclair Real Estate was nothing but a vision. Tonight, as I stand before you in this magnificent room, I am overwhelmed by the legacy we have built together. We have weathered economic downturns, navigated shifting markets, and emerged not just intact, but stronger and more dominant than ever before. The crowd offered a polite round of applause. William soaked it up, placing a hand over his heart in a sickening gesture of fake humility. I watched his fingers tremble slightly against his tuxedo lapel. I knew my morning financial strike had worked. His accounts were frozen. He was bleeding out on stage and trying to hide the wound. But a man does not build a legacy alone, William continued, gesturing generously toward the front VIP table. I must thank my beautiful wife Catherine, who has been my anchor and the absolute grace of this family. Catherine offered a practiced demure wave to the applauding crowd. William then shifted his gaze to his daughter, his voice taking on a tone of manufactured intense emotional pride. And to my daughter Sloane. William smiled, projecting the image of a doting, fiercely protective patriarch. Sloane, you have always been the absolute light of my life. You are the perfect daughter, a brilliant mind, and the true heir to the Sinclair legacy. You have brought nothing but honor to our family name. Your strategic vision is exactly what this company needs as we step into our next 30 years of unprecedented growth. Sloane beamed, blowing a kiss to her father, while subtly adjusting her posture so the press photographers could get a better angle of her diamonds. She soaked up the validation she had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to achieve. William gripped the edges of the podium, leaning forward as he prepared to deliver his ultimate victory speech. He needed this moment to be completely public. He needed the panicked investors in the room to hear the words so his creditors would back off the margin calls that Vanguard Acquisitions had triggered that very morning. Which brings me to the most exciting announcement of the evening, William declared, his voice rising in volume and theatrical excitement. The future of real estate is not just in bricks and mortar, it is in technology, logistics, and rapid modernization. To achieve this, we need fresh energy. We need partners who understand the immense value of joining an established elite dynasty. Therefore, I am incredibly proud to officially announce that Sinclair Real Estate is merging with the revolutionary logistics platform founded by Terrence. William extended his arm toward the front table, gesturing for him to come up to the stage. Terrence calmly buttoned his tuxedo jacket and walked up the steps with absolute precision, his face giving away nothing. Terrence has built a remarkable little company. William continued, his tone dripping with a subtle, deeply ingrained condescension, perfectly masked as praise. But tonight, we are bringing his raw talent under the Sinclair umbrella. We are going to elevate his platform into the luxury corporate sphere. Terrence joining our family means securing a future you could have only dreamed of when you first started writing code in that garage. A polite smattering of laughter rippled through the old money crowd. Terrence stood next to William, his dark eyes scanning the room, locking onto the exact faces of the investors William was so desperately trying to appease. I have the final merger contracts right here, William announced triumphantly, pulling a thick leather binder from the podium shelf and producing a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. I thought it would be deeply symbolic to sign these documents together right here in front of the people who have supported our dynasty for 3 decades. Terrence, my boy, the floor is yours. Say a few words and let us make this historic partnership official. William stepped back, handing the microphone to Terence with a victorious, predatory smile. He fully believed he had won. He believed he had successfully trapped his future son-in-law in a public spectacle, forcing a signature that would instantly transfer Terence's entire net worth into the bleeding Sinclair accounts. I stepped out of the shadows of the balcony, making my way toward the grand staircase. Terence took the microphone. He did not look at the contract. He did not look at the gold pen. He reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out the small black flash drive. Terence looked at the heavy gold pen in William's hand, then shifted his dark, penetrating gaze out at the sprawling audience of Chicago elites. 30 years, Terence said, his voice resonating through the grand ballroom with an absolute terrifying clarity. 30 years of building a legacy. When I was invited into this family, I was told I lacked a certain refinement. I was told that my company, built in a freezing garage in Detroit, needed the sophisticated aristocratic touch of the Sinclair dynasty to truly reach its potential. He paused, letting the silence stretch across the cavernous room. The polite smiles of the investors began to falter. William's triumphant expression tightened into a mask of rigid confusion. I was told, Terence continued, turning slightly to look down at Sloane, who was sitting frozen at the VIP table, that merging my life's work with this real estate empire was the opportunity of a lifetime. A chance to elevate my raw coding talent into the luxury market. A chance to be part of a real family. Terence held up the small black flash drive, the stage lights glinting off its metallic casing. But my talent is not just writing code. My talent is identifying systemic inefficiencies. My talent is finding exactly where a system is leaking, where it is failing, and where it is fundamentally fraudulent. Terence turned to the audiovisual technician stationed at the side of the stage, a man Terence's own security team had quietly replaced an hour before the gala began. Terence tossed him the flash drive. "Run it," Terence commanded. The massive digital screens behind the stage, previously displaying the elegant gold and white Sinclair real estate logo, suddenly flickered. The logo vanished, replaced by massive high-definition spreadsheets. Red numbers glared aggressively across the screens. Bank statements, wire transfers, offshore account routing numbers, and deeply buried ledger entries were suddenly broadcast in 20-foot high definition for every major investor in the city to see. The crowd gasped in unison. A collective shockwave ripped through the ballroom. William lunged forward, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. "Terence, what is this? Turn those screens off immediately. Security, get up here." "Those screens," Terence said, stepping gracefully out of William's reach and addressing the panicked investors, directly display the actual, unredacted financial reality of Sinclair real estate. What you are looking at is over $300 million in off-balance sheet liabilities. You are looking at predatory shadow loans, defaulted commercial mortgages, and a debt-to-equity ratio that guarantees absolute immediate insolvency." Sloane leaped from her chair, her face ashen, the heavy diamond necklace suddenly looking like a shiny chain dragging her to the bottom of the ocean. "Terence, stop it. Have you lost your mind? We are supposed to be getting married." "I found my mind." "Sloane," Terence replied, his voice dropping to a lethal, freezing calm that echoed perfectly through the microphone. "Right around the time I traced the $400,000 you embezzled from my personal accounts over the last 30 days. You used my money to pay for your illegal offshore gambling debts in Macau and to cover the lease on your mother's Hamptons estate because your family is completely broke." Catherine collapsed back into her chair, covering her face with her hands, as the press corral erupted into a frenzy of flashing cameras and shouted questions. "You handed me a prenuptial agreement hiding a cross-collateralization clause," Terence announced, making sure the acoustics of the room caught every single syllable of their betrayal. "You intended to use my logistics platform to absorb your catastrophic financial failures. You planned to legally hijack my proprietary algorithms to feed your shadow lenders the second your father defaulted. You thought I was just a naive mark who would sign away his freedom and his company for a seat at your counterfeit table." Terence picked up the heavy leather binder containing the merger contracts. He did not tear it. He simply dropped it over the edge of the podium, letting it land on the stage floor with a pathetic, hollow thud. "I am not signing your bailout." Terence declared, his posture radiating unyielding authority. I am not marrying your daughter. The merger is dead. And as of this exact moment, I am initiating civil and criminal proceedings against Sloan Sinclair for wire fraud and embezzlement. William was hyperventilating frantically, gesturing to the hotel security guards standing by the exits, but the guards did not move an inch. They had already received their new orders. But do not worry, William Terence said, his tone shifting from righteous anger to a chilling professional courtesy. You are not leaving empty-handed tonight. You desperately needed a partner to take over your liabilities, and you have one. Allow me to introduce the person who actually owns this entire room, the CEO of Vanguard Acquisitions and your largest, most ruthless creditor. Terence stepped back from the podium and extended his hand toward the grand staircase. I walked down the remaining marble steps, the emerald silk of my gown sweeping across the carpet like a spreading fire. The sea of Chicago elites parted for me instantly, scrambling to get out of my way. They did not know my true face yet, but they smelled the blood in the water, and they recognized the absolute terrifying authority radiating from my every step. William stared at me, his eyes wide with desperate, confused hope. His brain scrambling in a state of sheer panic, still only saw Eleanor Frost. He saw the billionaire savior he had pitched to at the charity gala, the woman he thought was going to inject $50 million into his dying company. Ms. Frost. William gasped, gripping the podium microphone like a life raft, his voice cracking with utter terror. Ms. Frost. Please, this is a terrible misunderstanding. A disgruntled ex-fiancé throwing a tantrum to ruin us. Our portfolio is solid. Vanguard Acquisitions promised a capital injection. You said we could find a mutually beneficial arrangement. I climbed the carpeted steps to the stage, my heels clicking sharply against the polished wood. Terence handed me the microphone, giving me a brief, deeply respectful nod, before stepping back into the shadows to watch the execution unfold. I never promised you a capital injection, William, I said, my voice echoing through the dead silent, captivated ballroom. I told you I was reviewing your primary lender agreements, and my review is completely finished. I turned my back to my father and faced the audience, locking eyes with the panicked bank executives sitting at the front tables. Good evening. As Terence so eloquently demonstrated on these screens, Sinclair Real Estate is not a functioning corporate entity. It is a desperate Ponzi scheme built on toxic assets and systemic fraud. William Sinclair has spent the last decade taking out massive loans from unregulated shadow lenders to cover his defaulting commercial properties, creating a cascading web of cross-default provisions. He has been lying to his shareholders, his board, and the public. I paused, letting the devastating reality sink deeply into the minds of the people who had blindly trusted his brand. Over the past 6 months, my firm Vanguard Acquisitions has methodically purchased every single piece of debt attached to the Sinclair name. I bought your primary commercial mortgages. I bought your mezzanine financing. I bought the high-risk junk bonds you desperately issued last quarter to keep the lights on. William stumbled backward, physically reacting as if I had driven a blade right through his ribs. You bought my debt, all of it. Every last penny, I confirmed, turning my icy gaze back to him. You owe Vanguard Acquisitions precisely $342 million. And because you are an arrogant, sloppy businessman who relies on fake charm instead of legal diligence, you failed to read the acceleration clauses I buried in the acquisition paperwork when those loans were transferred to my holding company. Sloan was frozen in her chair, shaking violently, her hands clutching the edges of the table as the reality of her utter ruin washed over her. At exactly 9 o'clock this morning, I announced, my voice carrying the lethal, unstoppable weight of an avalanche. I triggered the cross-default clauses on your entire portfolio. I froze your operating accounts. I notified your remaining secondary creditors of your insolvency, which immediately initiated severe unpayable margin calls across the board. William gripped his chest, his breathing shallow, ragged, and desperate. You froze my accounts. I have payroll. I have vendors. This gala tonight. This gala is running on a declined credit card, I stated ruthlessly, loud enough for the press corral to capture the quote perfectly. You are completely bankrupt, William. Sinclair Real Estate no longer exists. Your properties, your assets, your corporate branding, and the very building your offices reside in are now legally the property of Vanguard Acquisitions. You have been entirely liquidated. The ballroom erupted into sheer pandemonium. Investors were pulling out their phones, shouting into them, desperately trying to salvage whatever minor financial ties they had to the Sinclair name. The press was in an absolute frenzy, cameras flashing blindly, capturing the exact historic moment a 30-year corporate dynasty was publicly slaughtered on its own stage. Why, William rasped, tears of absolute panic and defeat streaming down his flushed face. He fell to his knees on the stage, looking up at me like a beggar. Why would you do this? We have never done anything to you, Ms. Frost. Why target my family? We do not even know you. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him, looking down at the pathetic, broken man kneeling at my feet. The time for the corporate alias was over. The time for the billionaire mask was finished. You asked why I targeted your family, I said softly, but the microphone carried every syllable with crystal clarity. You should look closer, William. Take a very good look at the woman holding your execution orders. Look at my eyes. Look at my jaw. Look at the face you tried to erase. William blinked, his terrified, tear-filled eyes scanning my face. He stared at my features, the underlying structure that expensive skincare and 15 years of aging could not entirely mask. And then the realization hit him. The billionaire's savior illusion shattered completely, revealing the ghost of the 17-year-old girl he had tried to murder in the snow. No, William whispered, his voice trembling with a terror far deeper and much darker than financial ruin. He scrambled backward on the floor, shaking his head. No, it cannot be. You are. Eleanor Frost is a corporate shell. I declared, my voice ringing with 15 years of refined, hardened vengeance. My name is Nora Sinclair. I am the daughter you threw into a blizzard to die. I am the child whose trust fund you embezzled to build this fraudulent empire. And tonight, I have come to collect every single thing you owe me. The silence in the grand ballroom was so absolute, you could hear the soft whirring of the projector cooling fans overhead. The entire room of Chicago elites, banking executives, and voracious journalists stared at me, their collective breath hitched in their throats. William staggered to his feet. His meticulously groomed hair was plastered to his forehead with cold sweat. The sheer panic in his eyes rapidly morphed into a cornered, frantic rage. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his face contorting into a mask of desperate denial. Do not listen to a word this woman says, William shouted, his voice cracking violently through the microphone he had snatched back from the podium. She is insane. She is a clinically diagnosed psychopath. This is a targeted smear campaign by a deranged stalker trying to extort my family. My daughter Nora died years ago. This woman is a highly paid corporate spy using stolen identities to manipulate my investors. Security. Arrest her immediately. She is having a psychotic break on my stage. He looked wildly at the crowd, trying to force his gaslighting onto a room full of people who dealt in hard numbers, not emotional hysterics. He expected the old money elite to blindly side with him to help him discard me, just like he had done 15 years ago. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I simply turned my head toward the audiovisual booth and gave a single sharp nod. The massive screens behind William instantly shifted. The red ledgers of his bankrupt real estate empire vanished, replaced by stark, high-resolution scans of legal documents dating back nearly 2 decades. The font was unmistakable. They were official bank records, trust fund establishment charters, and notarized withdrawal slips. I stepped closer to him, my voice projecting with chilling, inescapable clarity over the sound system. You have always been a remarkably lazy liar, William. You rely on volume to cover up your lack of evidence. But as I said before, math is unforgiving. I gestured to the massive screens. Let us look at the foundation of your precious 30-year legacy. Let us look at how Sinclair Real Estate was truly capitalized. The screen zoomed in on a specific document bearing my late mother's signature and the seal of a major federal bank. This is the irrevocable trust fund established by my mother prior to her death, I announced, ensuring every journalist in the press corral captured the image. It was seeded with exactly $2 million explicitly designated for my care, education, and living expenses to be released upon my 18th birthday. The screen flashed to a new slide. A chronological list of wire transfers complete with William's signature, highlighting a massive sustained hemorrhage of capital. And these, I continued, my tone slicing through his frantic protests, are the withdrawal authorizations signed by William Sinclair. Notice the dates, ladies and gentlemen. The largest withdrawals occurred exactly 15 years ago, during the very same month he locked a 17-year-old girl out in a subzero blizzard. He did not throw me out because I was a thief. He threw me out because the trust fund required a mandatory third-party audit the moment I became a legal adult. He had already drained the entire $2 million to pay off a massive SEC fine and to purchase the initial commercial properties that built this pathetic company. Catherine let out a sharp, horrified gasp from her table. She had known about the abuse, but the sheer scale of the financial fraud and the impending federal prison sentence was finally registering in her vacant mind. William gripped his head, pacing frantically on the stage. That money was for family expenses. He screamed, spit flying from his lips. I was your father. I housed you. I fed you. I had every right to use those funds to maintain our standard of living. You were a minor. It was my money to manage. You used it to buy Catherine's diamonds, I shot back, my voice dripping with absolute venom. You used it to buy Sloane's private school tuition. You used my mother's money to fund your fraudulent vanity project, and when the audit drew near, you tried to murder the only person who could testify against you. The press corral erupted. The sound of camera shutters sounded like a swarm of locusts. William looked out at the sea of flashing lights, realizing with crushing finality that he could not gaslight a bank statement. He could not manipulate a wire transfer. His entire existence was exposed as a blood-soaked theft. Seeing her father completely destroyed, Sloane snapped. The pristine, sophisticated heiress illusion shattered, revealing the feral, desperate parasite underneath. She scrambled up the stage steps, her heavy rented gown tangling around her ankles. She shoved past William and lunged toward me, her eyes wild, her face twisted in an ugly tear-streaked sneer. You jealous, bitter hag, Sloane shrieked, pointing a manicured finger an inch from my face. This is not about money. This is about you being obsessed with my life. You have always hated me because I got everything you never had. You orchestrated this entire fake corporate takeover just to ruin my wedding. Sloane turned toward the audience, throwing her arms out in a theatrical, hysterical plea for sympathy. She is trying to steal my fiancé. Look at her. She cornered Terrence at the bar. She filled his head with lies because she is a miserable, lonely spinster who cannot stand to see me happy. She wants Terrence for herself. She spun back to face the shadows where Terrence had retreated, her voice pitching into a desperate fake sob. Terrence, baby, please. You have to see through this. She is a manipulative psychopath. She is trying to brainwash you to destroy our love. Tell them you do not believe her. The silence that followed her hysterical outburst was heavy and absolute. From the dark edge of the stage, Terrence stepped forward. The spotlight caught the sharp lines of his midnight blue tuxedo. He did not look like a man whose heart was broken. He looked like an executioner who had just finished sharpening the blade. He walked slowly toward Sloane. She reached out to grab his lapels, offering him a watery, pleading smile, expecting the protective, loving man she had manipulated for 8 months to shield her from the fallout. Terrence did not even raise his hands to catch her. He simply sidestepped her grasp, leaving her stumbling forward. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope. You flatter yourself, Sloane Terrence said, his deep voice carrying a terrifying, metallic calm. You think you are worth a corporate conspiracy? You think a woman who controls billions of dollars wants to steal a partner from a woman who has to steal from my checking account just to afford her own shoes? Sloane froze, the fake tears instantly drying up. Terrence, what are you talking about? I never stole anything. Terrence unclasped the envelope. With a single violent flick of his wrist, he tossed the contents into the air. Dozens of glossy, high-definition photographs rained down onto the stage floor, scattering across the polished wood right at Sloane's feet. The camera flashes from the press corral went into overdrive, capturing every single image before Sloane could even attempt to cover them up. The photos were explicit, time-stamped, and undeniable. They showed Sloane in various states of undress in the back VIP rooms of exclusive Chicago nightclubs. She was not alone. She was wrapped around the senior loan broker from the very shadow lending firm that held her father's toxic debt. She was kissing him, accepting expensive gifts from him, and clearly leveraging her physical assets to buy her father extra time on his margin calls. The crowd gasped. Catherine let out a muffled shriek and hid her face behind her sequined clutch. Terrence picked up the microphone, his eyes locked onto Sloane, who was staring at the photos in absolute paralyzed horror. "My security team operates at a level, your father's bargain bin. Private investigators could not even comprehend," Terrence stated, his voice echoing with ruthless authority. "While you were telling me you were exhausted from wedding planning, you were sleeping with your father's creditors to renegotiate his interest rates. But your infidelity is actually the least offensive thing you did to me." Terrence signaled the audiovisual booth again. The screens behind them shifted from Nora's trust fund documents to a new set of data. "These are my personal bank statements," Terrence announced to the room, forcing every investor to look at the massive red circles highlighting specific wire transfers. "In the last 30 days, my devoted fiancé embezzled $400,000 of my liquid capital. She funneled the cash through offshore casinos to clean it, then dumped it into her mother's personal accounts to pay for the lease on their fake Hamptons estate." Sloane fell to her knees, frantically trying to gather the photos, but there were too many. She was scrambling on the floor in her designer gown, like a beggar searching for dropped coins. "Terrence, please," she sobbed, her voice stripping away the aristocratic accent she had practiced for years, revealing raw, unadulterated panic. "I had to. My father was going to lose everything. I was going to pay you back after the merger. I love you." "You do not know what love is," Terrence replied, his tone devoid of any mercy. "You looked at me, and you did not see a partner. You saw a self-made black man from Detroit, and your ingrained, disgusting entitlement told you I was nothing but a gullible wallet. You thought my background made me desperate for your high society approval. You thought you could smile in my face, mock my origins behind my back, and legally hijack my entire logistics company through a fraudulent prenuptial agreement." Terrence reached down and grabbed her left hand, lifting it up just enough so the stage lights caught the massive diamond engagement ring he had bought her. "You are a parasite," Sloane Terrence declared, his voice booming with absolute finality. "You produce nothing. You build nothing. You just attach yourself to people who actually work for a living and suck them dry until there is nothing left but a husk." He released her hand, letting her slump back onto the floor amidst the scattered evidence of her betrayal. "There will be no wedding," Terrence announced to the dead-silent ballroom. "The engagement is permanently canceled. My legal team filed a civil suit against you for grand larceny and wire fraud 3 hours ago. The authorities are currently freezing your passport. You are not just losing your wealthy lifestyle tonight, Sloane. You are losing your freedom. Keep the ring. You are going to need it to pay your defense attorneys." Terrence turned his back on her completely. He did not look at William, who was leaning against the podium, grasping his chest, as if having a heart attack, entirely ignored by the crowd. Terrence walked over to me, extending his arm in a gesture of profound mutual respect. I took his arm, turning to face the ruined, shattered remains of the Sinclair dynasty. The media was in an absolute frenzy, broadcasting the total annihilation of Chicago's most arrogant family live to the entire world. The gaslighting had failed. The illusions were burned to ash. The truth had finally been dragged into the light, and it was glorious. The absolute destruction of the Sinclair dynasty was a spectacle that even the most ruthless Wall Street veterans in the room watched with wide-eyed, paralyzed fascination. Terrence and I stood together at the edge of the stage, the blinding flashes of the press cameras washing over us like a strobe light. Behind us, the shattered remains of the Sinclair family finally broke. The sheer, overwhelming reality of total insolvency and impending federal prison sentences snapped whatever fragile transactional bond had held William and Catherine together. Catherine hauled herself up from her chair. Her rented emeralds clashed violently with her pale, terrified face. The sophisticated aristocratic matriarch illusion vanished, instantly replaced by the vicious self-serving survivalist I had always known her to be. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at her husband, her face contorting with rage. "You swore to me the accounts were insulated," Catherine shrieked, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated panic echoing through the hot microphones still active on the stage. "You looked me in the eyes and promised Vanguard was a silent capital injection. You told me the shadow loans were completely hidden in offshore blind trusts. You absolute incompetent fool, you have destroyed me." William turned on his wife, his face a terrifying mask of cornered rage. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched tuxedo collar. "I destroyed you. You parasitic leech. You drained $3 million from the operating accounts just last quarter to fund your pathetic country club galas. You demanded the Hamptons estate. You demanded the private jets to Paris. You bled my companies dry while complaining that the cash flow was not fast enough." Catherine scoffed a wild, hysterical sound that made several investors in the front row physically flinch. "I am not taking the fall for your massive real estate frauds, William. I will not spend a single day in a federal penitentiary because you do not know how to cover your tracks. I will call the district attorney myself. I will hand over every single one of your hidden ledgers. I know where you buried the Cayman Island Shell Company documents. I have the safety deposit box keys for your Zurich accounts. I will trade you to the authorities for full immunity." "You vindictive snake!" William roared, lunging toward her before freezing as the press corral captured his violent outburst on live television. "You are just as complicit. You signed the joint tax returns. You routed the stolen trust fund money into your personal accounts to buy your ridiculous jewelry. If I go down, Catherine, I am dragging you straight to the bottom of the ocean with me. I will make sure we share adjoining cells." Sloane sat on the floor, weeping uncontrollably, as her parents viciously tore each other apart over the microphone. The perfect elite family unit had dissolved into a pack of starving wolves fighting over a rotting carcass. There was no loyalty, no love, no foundational bond. There was only greed and the terrifying, suffocating realization that the money was permanently gone. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance of the grand ballroom slammed open with a booming, authoritative crack that instantly silenced the bickering couple on stage. The private hotel security parted immediately, stepping aside to allow a tactical wedge of men and women in dark windbreakers to enter the room. The bold yellow letters FBI were emblazoned across their backs. They were accompanied by agents from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. The federal agents moved with swift, terrifying precision, immediately fanning out to secure every exit and surround the perimeter of the stage. "Nobody leaves this room until the premises are entirely secured." The lead agent barked, his voice carrying absolute, unquestionable jurisdiction. The crowd of investors and socialites scrambled backward, overturning chairs and dropping champagne glasses in their desperate rush to avoid being caught in the federal crosshairs. And then, walking slowly through the corridor of federal agents, came the architect of this entire reckoning. My grandmother, Genevieve Sinclair. She was 82 years old, walking with the assistance of a sleek, silver-handled cane, but she commanded the cavernous ballroom with the absolute authority of a reigning monarch. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, her silver hair pulled back into a severe, elegant twist. Her posture was flawless. Her eyes, the same piercing blue as mine, were locked entirely on the sweating, terrified man standing on the stage. William stepped back, his knees hitting the wooden podium. He looked like a man watching his own executioner approach the block. All the fight, all the arrogant bluster drained right out of his body. Genevieve William choked out the name, scraping against his dry throat like sandpaper. Genevieve stopped at the base of the stage steps. She did not raise her voice, but the dead silence of the room amplified her words into a lethal verdict. "I told you 15 years ago in that hospital room, William, that if you ever breathed in my granddaughter's direction again, I would ensure you spent the rest of your miserable life in a federal penitentiary." She tapped her cane once against the marble floor. "I am a woman who keeps her promises." The tall, broad-shouldered special agent stepped forward, pulling a heavy stack of folded warrants from his jacket pocket. "William Sinclair, The agent announced, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and transnational tax evasion. We have federal warrants to seize all physical and digital assets connected to Sinclair Real Estate and its affiliated offshore holding companies. William shook his head frantically, holding his hands up as if he could physically push the federal charges away. No, no, this is a mistake. I am a pillar of this community. I have lawyers. I have a board of directors. You cannot just storm into my gala and do this. Your board of directors has already been detained at your corporate headquarters, Genevieve stated coldly, her gaze cutting right through his pathetic denial. And your lawyers are currently negotiating their own plea deals by handing over your hidden servers to the Department of Justice. Did you truly believe you could outsmart me, William? You spent the last decade routing stolen capital through Cayman Island shell entities thinking your digital paper trail was untraceable. But you forgot who trained the woman standing on that stage. Genevieve looked up at me, a brief, profoundly proud smile touching her lips, before she turned her icy glare back to her former son-in-law. Nora and I have spent the last 6 months mapping every single fraudulent transaction you executed. Genevieve continued, her voice slicing through his remaining defenses. We tracked the $2 million you embezzled from my daughter's trust fund. We tracked the fabricated commercial leases you used to secure your shadow loans. We handed the Federal Bureau of Investigation a fully verified, bulletproof dossier of your entire criminal enterprise. You did not just bankrupt your company tonight. You handed the federal government the rope to hang you. Catherine let out a piercing, guttural shriek as 2 federal agents moved up the stage steps, pulling heavy steel handcuffs from their belts. I had nothing to do with the offshore accounts, Catherine screamed, backing away from her husband and holding her hands up in frantic surrender. I am just a spouse. I did not know about the Caymans. I am a victim here. He lied to me too. Save it for the federal prosecutor. Catherine. Genevieve dismissed her with a disgusted wave of her hand. Ignorance is not a defense when your signature is on the joint tax returns that defrauded the IRS out of $40 million. You will have plenty of time to practice your victim routine in a minimum security holding cell. The federal agents grabbed William by the arms, spinning him around and slamming him face first against the wooden podium he had just used to boast about his legacy. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs ratcheting securely around his wrists echoed through the microphone, broadcasting his absolute, undeniable defeat to the entire room. You cannot do this to me. William sobbed, his face pressed against the wood, completely stripped of his arrogance, his wealth, and his dignity. I am William Sinclair. I built this city. I built an empire. You built a slaughterhouse, I said, walking over to stand right beside him. I looked down at the pathetic, weeping man who had once thrown me into a blizzard without a second thought. And now you are the one on the chopping block. The agents hauled William to his feet. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, animalistic terror. The realization that his life was permanently over had finally set in. Nora, please. You are my daughter. You have my blood. Tell them to stop. Tell them I will pay it all back. I will sign whatever you want. I am sorry. I am so sorry. I leaned in close, ensuring only he and the federal agents could hear my final words to him. You ceased being my father the second you locked that door and turned off the porch lights 15 years ago. Enjoy the cold, William. I hear the federal penitentiary system has terrible heating. The agents marched William down the stage steps, guiding him roughly through the parted crowd of horrified socialites and flashing camera lenses. Catherine was arrested moments later, weeping hysterically as her rented emeralds were stripped from her neck and placed into a clear plastic evidence bag by a female agent. The perfect aristocratic couple was paraded out of the grand ballroom in matching steel bracelets, their entire fraudulent existence burned to the ground in front of the exact high society audience they had sacrificed their humanity to impress. Genevieve stood at the base of the stairs, leaning on her cane. I walked down to meet her, Terence flanking my side. My grandmother reached out, grasping my hand with a fierce, unwavering pride. You executed the strike flawlessly, Nora, Genevieve said softly, her blue eyes shining with absolute victory. The debt is paid in full. Genevieve's words hung in the air. The ballroom felt like a tomb. The federal agents had cleared out with my father and stepmother in handcuffs, and the panicked investors had fled as if the hotel itself were on fire. The catering staff had vanished. Only the overturned chairs, dropped champagne flutes, and the scattered damning photographs remained on the polished wood floor. Genevieve and I stood together, savoring the absolute silence of our victory. Then a pathetic, ragged sob broke the quiet. I looked down. Sloane was still on the floor. Terrence had left the building minutes ago, walking out the front doors a free and vindicated man. He did not look back. Sloane had been abandoned by her fiancé, her parents, and the high society sycophants she had spent her entire life trying to impress. Her custom designer gown was wrinkled and stained with spilled wine. The massive diamond necklace Terrence had given her felt like a cruel joke against her pale, tear-streaked collarbone. She dragged herself across the floor, her hands scraping against the wood, and stopped right at the tips of my emerald silk heels. The golden child, the flawless heiress who had sneered at me and framed me 15 years ago, was crawling like a wounded animal. She grabbed the hem of my dress, her knuckles white. "Nora, please," Sloane begged, her voice a wet, desperate wheeze. Her perfectly contoured makeup was running in dark streaks down her face. "You have to help me. You are my sister." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no vindication. Just the cold, clinical observation of a parasite that had finally run out of hosts. "Sister," I repeated the word, tasting like ash. "You lost the right to use that word the night you took a blade to your own arm and pointed a finger at me." "Nora, you do not understand," Sloane gasped, her chest heaving as true, unfiltered terror took over. "The offshore accounts, the guys from Macau, the shadow lenders I was sleeping with to extend my father's credit lines. They are not like federal agents. They do not arrest you. They do not send lawyers. I owe them $15 million by midnight tonight. I promised them Terrence's $50 million wire transfer would clear. If I do not pay them, they are going to kill me. They told me exactly what they would do to me if the money did not arrive." She pressed her face against my shoes, sobbing hysterically. "I will do anything," Sloane wailed, completely abandoning every ounce of dignity she possessed. "I will clean your offices. I will sign a public confession. I will go on television and tell the world exactly what a monster I am. Just give me the money. You have billions, Nora. Vanguard has billions. $50 million is a rounding error to you. Please just pay them off and I will disappear forever. I am begging you. Do not let them find me." I watched her tremble. This was the girl who had smirked behind her hands while our father threw me into a deadly blizzard. This was the woman who had just tried to strip a brilliant, self-made man of his entire life's work. She expected me to write a check because she believed deep down that her suffering was somehow more important than the suffering she had inflicted on everyone else. I reached down and firmly pried her fingers off the silk fabric of my gown. I stepped back, putting physical distance between my success and her ruin. "You think this is a negotiation, Sloane?" I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the empty ballroom. "You think a public apology balances out 15 years of theft, gaslighting, and attempted murder? You think you can buy your life with fake tears?" I reached into my designer clutch. I did not pull out a checkbook. I did not pull out a corporate bank card. I pulled out a single crisp, folded $20 bill. I held it between two fingers for a moment, letting the stage lights catch the green ink before I let it go. It fluttered through the air, drifting back and forth, until it landed gently on the floor right next to Sloane's knee. Sloane stared at the bill, her eyes wide with frantic confusion. "What is this? I need $15 million. I cannot survive on this. They will hunt me down." I looked at her with eyes like shattered glass. 15 years ago, I said, my tone lethal and exact, after you planted Catherine's diamond necklace in my backpack, after you watched William strike me and drag me to the front door. Catherine reached into her purse. She threw a $20 bill out onto the freezing porch. She told me it was a problem for a thief to figure out on her own. Sloane gasped, the memory hitting her like a physical blow. "Now you are the thief," I continued, stepping closer so she could feel the absolute finality of my words. "You stole from Terrence. You stole from my mother's trust fund. You stole your entire pathetic existence. And this $20 bill is your bailout. It is the exact measure of grace your family afforded me when I was freezing to death in the dark. Sloane stared at the $20 bill as if it were a venomous snake. Nora, please, I have nowhere to go. I cannot go home. The press will be waiting at the mansion. I let out a sharp, dark laugh. You certainly cannot go to the mansion, I agreed, my voice ringing with absolute triumph. Because that mansion in Lincoln Park no longer belongs to your father. I did not just freeze William's corporate accounts this morning. I bought the deed to your primary residence directly from the bank during the default liquidation. Sloane's mouth fell open, her face draining of whatever color it had left. My private security team arrived at the Lincoln Park estate exactly 1 hour ago. I announced delivering the final fatal strike. They changed the locks. They activated a completely new security grid. Your custom designer clothes, your imported shoes, your luxury handbags, and every single piece of jewelry you bought with my mother's money are all currently locked inside property legally owned by Vanguard Acquisitions. Sloane shook her head violently, her hands clutching her chest as if she could not draw breath. No, no, you cannot do that. That is my house. You are homeless, Sloane, I declared, raising my chin, standing tall as the undisputed victor of a war they had started. You have no fiancé. You have no parents to protect you. You have no family wealth, no credit score, and no sanctuary. You spent your entire life believing you were superior because you stood on a golden pedestal built entirely out of stolen money and lies. Now the pedestal is gone. I turned to Genevieve. My grandmother offered me a small, satisfied smile, leaning gracefully on her silver-handled cane. We turned our backs on the wreckage of the Sinclair family. Use that $20 to call an Uber, Sloane, I said over my shoulder as we walked toward the grand exit of the ballroom. Because the Shadowlenders are coming and you are officially out of time. Welcome to the cold. The heavy wooden doors of the Drake Hotel swung open for us, held by my private security detail. As Genevieve and I walked out into the crisp, rainy Chicago night, the frantic, hysterical screams of my sister echoed uselessly in the empty ballroom behind us, entirely ignored, entirely forgotten, and entirely deserved. 6 months later, the dust from the Drake Hotel collapse had finally settled into a permanent, suffocating reality for the Sinclair family. William's highly publicized federal trial was an absolute slaughter. Stripped of his high-priced legal team because Vanguard Acquisitions had frozen his retainers, he was represented by a completely overwhelmed public defender. The federal judge, presented with the mountain of unassailable financial evidence Genevieve and I had meticulously curated, showed absolutely no mercy. William was sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for wire fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. The man who had once sneered at me from his marble foyer, who had believed his wealth made him a god, now spent his days scrubbing greasy cafeteria trays in a fluorescent-lit prison. His arrogant bluster was entirely broken by the brutal, unyielding hierarchy of federal incarceration. He sent me a single, pathetic letter begging for a commissary deposit so he could buy decent soap. I ran it through my paper shredder without a second thought. Catherine and Sloane did not fare any better. With their assets entirely seized and their high society network violently severing all ties, overnight they were forcefully evicted into the harsh reality they had mocked their entire lives. They now shared a decaying pest-infested one-bedroom apartment in a crime-ridden neighborhood on the far south side of Chicago. The Shadowlenders Sloane had been terrified of did eventually catch up with her. She had narrowly avoided physical violence by surrendering every remaining piece of hidden jewelry she had stashed away and signing over 70% of her future wages in a predatory repayment plan. Sloane, the former aristocratic heiress who used to snap her fingers at waiters, now worked exhausting double shifts, scrubbing toilets and changing bedsheets at a budget highway motel. Her manicured hands were permanently calloused, blistered, and raw from harsh cleaning chemicals. Catherine, stripped of her designer gowns and country club lunches, managed the graveyard shift at a 24-hour laundromat, constantly terrified of the local gangs. Their tiny apartment was a vicious, inescapable battleground. Without my father's stolen wealth to buffer their toxic personalities, they turned on each other like starving animals. Thin walls meant their neighbors frequently called the police to report their screaming matches over stolen tip money, expired groceries, and bitter accusations about who was truly responsible for their total ruin. Sloane blamed Catherine for enabling William. Catherine blamed Sloane for provoking Terence. They were permanently trapped in a prison of their own making, bound together by mutual hatred, absolute poverty, and the agonizing memory of the empire they had lost. In stark contrast to their miserable downfall, my empire was thriving with unstoppable momentum. The morning after the gala, Terence and I met in my Manhattan office, not as broken victims, but as two apex predators who had successfully cleared a toxic infection from our lives. He had fully stabilized his logistics company, completely insulated from the Sinclair fallout, thanks to his swift, ruthless severing of the prenuptial trap. We shook hands over my mahogany desk and formed a new, devastatingly effective corporate alliance. Vanguard Acquisitions provided the heavy capital backing, and his tech firm delivered the unparalleled algorithmic efficiency. Together, we began identifying and dismantling other fraudulent, bloated legacy corporations across the Midwest, restructuring them into lean, highly profitable enterprises. We became the most feared and respected corporate takeover duo on Wall Street. Our partnership extended far beyond cold balance sheets and quarterly earnings reports. Terence became one of the very few people on Earth I genuinely trusted. He was a man who understood the profound cost of betrayal and the absolute necessity of unbreakable boundaries. We frequently shared dinners at quiet, unpretentious restaurants, far away from the flashing cameras of the elite, discussing market trends, global supply chains, and the immense satisfaction of building generational wealth through genuine, honest labor. There was no romance between us, only a deep, forged-in-fire respect between two survivors who had weaponized their trauma into absolute power. He eventually introduced me to the woman he was newly dating. She was a brilliant, grounded pediatric surgeon who looked at him with actual, uncalculated love, completely unconcerned with the size of his bank account. I saw the quiet, steady peace in his dark eyes, the heavy tension of his previous toxic engagement entirely washed away. He had reclaimed his narrative, his dignity, and his future, just as I had reclaimed mine. Terence was a self-made titan who had refused to be a sacrificial lamb, and I was immensely proud to call him my closest ally. We had both looked into the terrifying hollow abyss of the Sinclair family and walked out stronger, sharper, and completely untouchable. They had tried to consume us to fuel their illusions, but we had become the fire that burned their entire fraudulent world to the ground. A few days later, I found myself sitting in my grandmother's private garden at her estate in New York. The afternoon sun was warm and golden, filtering through the ancient oak trees and casting long, peaceful shadows across the stone patio. It was a stark, beautiful contrast to the cold, clinical world of skyscrapers and hostile takeovers I had inhabited for so long. Genevieve sat across from me in a wrought iron chair, her silver hair catching the light like spun silk. She looked remarkably peaceful, her posture relaxed for the first time since she had found me in that Chicago hospital 15 years ago. She lifted her porcelain teacup with a steady hand, her movements graceful and timeless. "You look different, Nora," she said softly, her piercing blue eyes studying my face with a warmth that always made me feel safe. "The hardness in your eyes has finally shifted. You are no longer just a warrior fighting to survive the night. You are a woman who is finally allowed to live." I took a slow sip of my tea, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. "It took 15 years, Grandma, but I finally feel like the weight has been lifted. I am not looking over my shoulder anymore. I am not waiting for the other shoe to drop. For the first time, the silence doesn't feel lonely. It feels like freedom." Genevieve smiled, a look of profound, quiet pride on her face. "You were always meant for the light, Nora. You just had to build your own fortress to find it. I am proud of the woman you have become, not because of the billions in your firm's accounts, but because of your integrity. You protected Terence when you could have easily exploited his desperation. You chose justice over simple greed. That is the Sinclair legacy I always wanted for you. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand, feeling the strength in her paper-thin skin. Thank you for never giving up on me. You didn't just save my life that night. You gave me the tools to save myself. We sat in comfortable silence for a long time, the only sound being the distant chirping of birds and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Standing there in the quiet of that garden, I realized that my journey was never really about the money or the satisfaction of a perfect corporate execution. It was about reclaiming the power to define what family truly means. For most of my life, I was told that family was a matter of blood, a biological tie that obligated you to endure any amount of abuse. But the Sinclair family taught me a different, more brutal truth. Blood can be the very thing that betrays you. Blood can be the hand that strikes you and the person who locks the door in a blizzard. I had to lose my biological family to find my real one. I found it in a grandmother who broke every rule to find me. I found it in a partner like Terrence who stood by me when the truth got ugly. I found it in the people who choose to show up not because of a last name, but because of a shared soul. This is the beauty of a chosen family. It is a bond forged in respect, integrity, and the courage to be honest. It is a family that sees your value when you are at your lowest and stays by your side as you build your own light. My father spent 30 years building an empire on a foundation of lies, and it vanished in a single night. I spent 15 years building my life on a foundation of truth, and I have never been stronger. True wealth is not what you accumulate. It is the peace of mind you have when the sun goes down, knowing you walked with honor. What about you? Have you ever had to walk away from people who were supposed to love you to find the life you actually deserved? Have you ever discovered that the family you chose was stronger than the one you were born into? Share your story in the comments below. Let us build a community of survivors who chose themselves. If Nora's journey resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of standing your ground and finding your power. Remember, the storm might be cold, but you own the light. Thank you for joining me. Until next time, stay strong and stay true to your own vision.